Rock has always been synonymous with rebellion, excess, authenticity. But what no one tells you is that, sometimes, that authenticity also came with a pretty strong smell. Between endless tours, sleepless nights, liters of alcohol, mountains of drugs, and zero interest in personal hygiene. Many of the idols who shaped generations had something in common. They smelled really bad. It's not a myth. It's not an exaggeration. There are testimonies, interviews, and anecdotes that make it clear the real shock wasn't always in their music, but in their odor. Want to know who the most intense rockers were? Not for their talent, but for their aroma? Stick around, because this list smells like pure rock history. Number 14. The Sex Pistols. Paul Cook, Johnny Rotten. If punk had a golden rule, it was this: the dirtier, the better. And in that, Johnny Rotten, leader of the Sex Pistols, was practically a prophet. Not just for his provocative attitude or his raspy voice, but because, literally, he slept in the same clothes for days. It was said that if you got too close to him, you couldn't tell if you were smelling rebellion or fermented laundry. Several music industry folks even described the aroma of the Pistols' as exact quote, "the smell of a closed British pub on a Sunday morning." And the most punk thing of all? Johnny loved that effect. For him, being clean was synonymous with belonging to the system, and that was what really smelled bad to him. Before we move on, I'd love to hear your experience. Did you know this about Axl? Leave it in the comments below, I'll read them. Let's keep going. Number 13. Lemmy Kilmister, Motörhead. If rock had an official smell, it'd probably be a mix of sweat, cigarettes, and cheap whiskey, or in other words, Lemmy Kilmister. The leader of Motörhead wasn't just a legend of heavy rock, he was also an expert at defying common sense and soap. Showering is for people who don't drink whiskey. Yes, he said that. Lemmy was rough, dirty, and proud of it. His body odor wasn't an oversight, it was part of his character. A guy who drank Jack Daniels like it was water, barely slept, and thought deodorant was a betrayal of rock's spirit. For many, Motörhead was dirty noise. For others, it was also dirty smell. But Lemmy wasn't there to smell good. He was there to shred your ears and live like a true outlaw. Number 12. Bob Dylan. Before he was a Nobel laureate, before he electrified the world, and before he became a legend, Bob Dylan was a young troubadour with a guitar, sharp lyrics, and a look that screamed, "I don't give a damn." According to several biographers, during his folk days in Greenwich Village, Dylan wasn't exactly the cleanest guy around. Dirty clothes, unruly hair, untrimmed nails, and a constant breath of black cigarettes were part of his bohemian essence. In an interview from the time, a journalist described him as an absolute genius, but with the smell of an old ashtray. And of course, the guy spent entire days writing, playing in bars, and smoking non-stop. In his world, deodorant and shampoo were luxuries, or worse, distractions. In the end, Dylan was the people's poet, and if he came with a bit of grime on him, well, the people didn't smell so great. Number 11. Anthony Kiediss, Red Hot Chili Peppers. If we're talking intense, sweaty, and aromatically challenging bands, the early years of the Red Hot Chili Peppers take home several awards. And at the front of all that chaos was him, Anthony Kiediss, the soul of Californian funk rock, and the leader of a band that smelled like mayhem. They played in the nude, bodies covered in paint, sweating buckets under the lights, and with socks where one doesn't normally store underwear. Showering after? Only if there was time. And there wasn't always time. In interviews, they admitted they didn't care much about personal hygiene. Kiediss wrote in his autobiography that during early tours, they slept anywhere, sweated non-stop at shows, and sometimes went days without a decent shower. Basically, if you got close to the backstage of a Red Hot show in the 1980s, the first thing to hit you wasn't flea or bass, it was the smell of man in full combustion. But in their world of funk, punk, and animal energy, hygiene was just a detail. The sweat was part of the show. Before we go on, tell me something. Did you imagine rock could literally stink? If this video surprised you, subscribe to the channel and get ready for more stories like this. Let's keep going. Number 10. Sid Vicious, Sex Pistols. If punk had a dark, messy, and pretty stinky face, it was undoubtedly Sid Vicious. The Sex Pistols' bassist was the embodiment of "I don't care about anything," and that included personal hygiene too. Seeing Sid in a dressing room or on the street was like seeing someone who just escaped a fight in an alley, and he probably had. He was covered in sweat, grime, and often his own blood from self-inflicted cuts during shows. Sid didn't bathe, he didn't change clothes, he didn't treat his wounds, and he didn't care. For him, it was all part of the character. Punk wasn't a music style, it was a form of active decomposition. According to several witnesses, getting close to Sid was exposing yourself to a cloud of sour sweat, stale cigarettes, cheap alcohol, and something else no one could quite identify. And yet, the guy had a magnetic aura, as if that smell of decay was part of the charm. With Sid Vicious, there were no filters, no deodorant, no dignity. Just punk, blood, and the smell of poorly healed rebellion. Number 9. Steven Tyler, Aerosmith. Today we see him as an elegant star, with extravagant looks and magazine cover smiles. But in the 1970s, Steven Tyler was an uncontrolled hurricane of sweat, excess, and a whole lot of tour, had a strong odor. In those golden years of sex, drugs, and rock, roll, Aerosmith was more a toxic storm than an organized band. In fact, Tyler and Joe Perry were known as the Toxic Twins, not just for what they consumed, but for how they smelled. In interviews, Tyler admitted to sharing sweaty clothes with Joe Perry during concerts. One day one wore the shirt, the next day the other. Washed? Zero. Changed? Only if it smelled like death. Add to that liters of alcohol, sleepless nights, endless cigarettes, and a diet of substances not exactly recommended by nutritionists. And you've got the perfect combo, a rock legend who could make a stadium vibrate and scare off anyone with a good sense of smell. Today, Steven Tyler shows up with glitter and glamour. But in the 1970s, you were more likely to catch something from a hug than a kiss. Number 8. Courtney Love. Not a classic rock star, but Courtney Love is an essential figure of grunge, the movement that turned dirt and disorder into a kind of art. And if there was a queen of that chaos, it was her. Courtney didn't just live in mess, she embraced it as a statement of principle. In several interviews, she admitted without shame that she could go weeks without bathing. And she didn't say it with embarrassment, but with pride. Hers wasn't the glamour of the red carpet, it was the glamour of the alley, of sweaty concerts, of old makeup that refused to leave. Her aesthetic was a mix of broken doll and punk spirit. Smudged lipstick, cigarette smell, 3-day sweat, and an unbeatable attitude. Many criticized her for her dirty, unkempt image, but for her, it was part of her art. "Why should I smell like flowers if my life isn't a garden?" she once said. Courtney Love didn't just break the standards of female rock. She also broke with soap, shampoo, and the idea that a star had to smell good. Number 7. Jim Morrison, The Doors.
This is the end.
Jim Morrison wasn't just a singer. He was a wild poet, a countercultural legend, and a man who, apparently, never gave much importance to soap. Morrison's image as a music genius was deeply tied to his bohemian, disheveled style. But beyond his profound lyrics and magnetism, there was something many noticed. His aroma was hard to ignore, and not for good reasons. According to several accounts, Jim rarely bathed, giving him a wild air and, some said, a very strong smell too. His life of excess and endless nights showed in his appearance and personal hygiene, which wasn't his priority. For Morrison, soap was as unnecessary as a suit and tie. "I'm a free man, and I don't have time for things they teach you in school," he once said, referring to conventions. And among those conventions was the shower. Jim Morrison was the essence of rock and roll, the man who defied norms, and in his world, disorder was more a symbol of freedom than a bother. If his music took you to another world, his smell reminded you that not everything that shines is clean. Hang on, are you holding your breath or are you liking the video? If it's the latter, subscribe to the channel if you love rock with all its grime and glory. Let's continue. Number 6. Keith Richards, The Rolling Stones. Keith Richards, the man who survived drugs, a life of excess, and an almost total lack of hygiene, and still stands tall. In the 1970s, Keith was famous not just for his guitar skills, but also for his aroma. Though today Keith Richards is relatively more put together, back in his glory days of the 1970s, he was known as the rocker who didn't smell like roses. Legend has it he only bathed when it was strictly necessary, which, by his own standards, probably didn't happen very often. The mix of drugs, alcohol, sleepless nights, and a total disregard for soap turned Richards into one of rock's most irreplaceable characters, though his smell was never part of the charm that made him famous. According to some witnesses from the era, Keith himself admitted that bathing was an administrative necessity more than a personal care ritual. The Rolling Stones, as a band, were never known for being the most polished in rock, but Keith took that messy, carefree style to another level. In dressing rooms, it was rumored his strong aroma was a blend of tobacco, liquor, and of course, unfiltered rock life. Keith Richards might have been a mess to some, But his legacy as a musician, survivor, and king of disorder remains intact. And though his hygiene wasn't the best, his talent was always clean as gold. Number 5. Allin. Allin, if you don't know him, is probably the worst case in rock history when it comes to personal hygiene. And that's saying something, considering we're talking about rockers who don't bathe. This man took the concept of wild rock to such a disgusting extreme that he could almost be considered the first performance artist of filth. Allin didn't just make music, he turned his own body into a declaration of war against society, hygiene, and any notion of rules. On stage, he went to disturbing extremes on stage, even using his own waste on the audience, and, in some cases, even cut himself. Who needs a bath when you can have a show like that? Allin wasn't just a musician, he was a phenomenon of anti-hygiene and perversion. For him, the stage wasn't just a place to play music, but a space to commit the most grotesque and repulsive acts that could defy any common sense. His commitment to the extreme knew no bounds. Grime was part of his art, and the disgusting atmosphere of his concerts was an extension of his personality. While many saw his shows as a kind of extreme punk protest, the reality is his performances didn't just challenge morality, they also challenged hygiene laws. His concept of rock wasn't just noise, it was physical, emotional, and of course olfactory chaos. Allin might be the most disgusting rocker in history, but his place in punk legend is secure. If his music didn't shock you, his extreme behavior and lack of hygiene left you speechless. Number 4. Ozzy Osbourne, Black Sabbath. Ozzy Osbourne is a rock legend, but his legacy isn't just marked by epic concerts and his unmistakable voice, but also by his complete disregard for personal hygiene. And of course, let's not forget the infamous bat-biting anecdote, but if you thought that was Ozzy's weirdest madness, you'd be surprised to learn there was a time he lived among pigeon droppings. Ozzy didn't just live in a mess, he played dumb when it came to the basics. From personal hygiene to eating habits, everything was adrift. It was known that Ozzy had no qualms about eating anything. From biting a bat to devouring a piece of rotten meat, his habits were as chaotic as his lifestyle. It's said that in his wildest days, Ozzy could go days without showering, and his room smelled like a mix of alcohol, sweat, and absolute disorder. The bathroom? Not a priority. Eating something healthy? Well, that wasn't either. In fact, in several interviews, he himself recounted how he'd sleep in rooms so dirty they almost blended with the surroundings, covered in filth and debris. If you don't mind living like an animal, you can do some really fun things, Ozzy used to say, referring to his wildest times. While today Ozzy is a relatively calmer figure, his legacy of excess lives on. And though his personal hygiene wasn't the best, what always shone was his talent and unique personality, which still amazes to this day. Number 3. Iggy Pop. Iggy Pop, also known as the Wild Boy of Rock, is one of the most iconic figures in punk and rock in general. But his name isn't just synonymous with musical madness, it's also synonymous with a total lack of hygiene. In the 1970s, Iggy Pop was chaos personified, and that showed not just in his music, but in his attitude toward bathing. In several interviews, Iggy said he went weeks without showering. Sweat is part of my energy, and mess is what makes me feel alive, he's mentioned more than once. During his wildest performances, he'd throw himself into the crowd all sweaty and covered in grime, almost as if it were an essential part of his performance. Iggy defied all the norms of classic rock, becoming a true example of how disorder and dirt became his calling card. At one of his most famous concerts, he dove into the crowd covered in sweat, and which sparked a reaction from fans who, though thrown off by his messiness, adored his raw, wild energy. It didn't matter if he got dirty or if his sweat and grime covered everyone around him. The mess was an extension of his art. Although Iggy has a more sedate style today, stories of his behavior in the 1970s are a perfect reflection of the chaos that defined punk. For Iggy, being messy and sweaty was more important than any polished image. As he himself said, "I'm not interested in appearance, I'm interested in authenticity." And for him, that meant living in absolute disorder. While many saw him as the portrait of chaos, rock history would never be the same without Iggy Pop, who turned grime and mess into art. Before we go on, let me ask you something. Did you survive this list without holding your nose? Then don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you're a rock fan. Let's keep going. Number 2. Kurt Cobain, Nirvana. Kurt Cobain, leader of Nirvana and one of grunge's most iconic artists. not only revolutionized music but also the concept of anti-hygiene as fashion. His style didn't just reflect a rejection of the system, but also of everything involved in looking clean or put together. In other words, Kurt was never a fan of the shower. In several interviews, Kurt openly admitted he rarely bathed or washed his hair. He himself said bathing was totally unnecessary, as grunge wasn't about looking clean but about conveying an aesthetic of chaos and rebellion. "Why bother bathing? The only thing I care about is making music," Kurt once stated, showing his indifference to social norms, including hygiene. Kurt's authentic grunge style was defined by dirty shirts, ripped jeans, and tangled hair, an appearance that became a symbol of youth's discomfort and fight against the system's expectations. For many, his unkempt look was more than an aesthetic choice. It was a revolution against imposed perfection, and in Kurt's mind, bathing was just another way to conform. In his golden era, Kurt was never one for big luxuries. His messy image wasn't just a fashion statement, but a mindset. Grunge wasn't about being clean, it was about being authentic, embracing dirt and imperfection. And though his attitude shocked many, the truth is his lack of concern for physical appearance made Kurt Cobain an even more rebellious and profound figure for his generation. Today, Kurt's legacy lives on, not just in his music, but in how his disregard for hygiene became a statement of authenticity that defined an entire generation. Number 1. Axl Rose, Guns N' Roses. Axl Rose, the undisputed leader of Guns N' Roses, is known not just for his incredible vocal talent and wild attitude, but also for his absolute disregard for hygiene. In the band's early years, Axl earned a reputation for going days without showering during intense tours, turning his unkempt image into an essential part of his bad boy persona. In fact, on his wildest tours, Axl wasn't just known for his eccentricities and band conflicts, but also for his lack of interest in personal grooming. "I don't care much about showering," he said in one interview, explaining that during tours, the last thing on his mind was hygiene. For Axl, what mattered was total chaos, raw energy, and of course, the dirty style that made him look like the typical rebellious 1980s rocker. According to close sources, it was common to see Axl show up to concerts in old, sweaty clothes, unbothered by his appearance. In fact, his dirty boy image became a sort of trademark, almost a symbol of his defiant attitude toward the music industry's expectations. In the early years, his messy look wasn't just a style statement, but a way to rebel against the polished image of other bands of the era. And though Axl is known for his explosive temper, his lack of care for hygiene became a reflection of rock's freedom and chaos. As the band grew more successful, Axl's attitude toward hygiene remained as chaotic as his music. For him, the concept of perfection had no place, and that attitude shaped Guns N' Roses' character. Today, Axl Rose remains a rock icon. His bad boy image and untamed attitude are still the essence of his legacy. And though his personal hygiene is no longer a topic, his influence on music and rock culture remains as powerful as ever. You see, rock isn't just about guitar solos, packed stadiums, and rebellion. Sometimes, it also smells like sweat, cheap whiskey, and shirts worn for the 5th time. These 14 singers showed us that attitude was everything, even if it meant forgetting soap for weeks. Some did it for rebellion, others out of neglect, and a few simply because that's who they were. The truth is, with or without deodorant, they all left an indelible mark on rock history. And you? Could you handle a meet and greet with any of them at their worst? Well, if you survived this list of smells, rebellion, and chaos, maybe you're ready for another trip. But this time, you won't sweat, you'll cry. Click the next video and join me to revisit the 10 most melancholic rock songs no one forgets. Because rock also knows how to sound like a goodbye, a broken heart, and tears on the pillow.